March 8, 1965, Da Nang Harbor, Republic of Vietnam. Through the humid morning mist, the landing craft ramps dropped with a metallic clang that echoed across the water. 49 tons of American steel rumbled onto Vietnamese soil, tracked behemoths that seemed impossibly out of place in a war defined by jungle ambushes and guerrilla shadows. The M48A3 Patton tanks of the 3rd Marine Tank Battalion ground forward through the sand, their 90mm main guns elevated against a sky that promised nothing but heat and rain. Vietnamese civilians stopped to stare at these iron monsters, while seasoned French advisers who remembered their own defeat shook their heads knowingly. "Les tanks dans la jungle," one muttered. "They're sending coffins, not cavalry." The skepticism wasn't limited to foreign observers. Within the highest circles of American military command, the deployment of main battle tanks to Southeast Asia sparked fierce debate that bordered on contempt. Vietnam was supposed to be different. This wasn't the European plain or the Korean peninsula where armor had proven its worth. This was triple canopy jungle, rice paddies that swallowed vehicles whole, monsoon mud that could trap a Sherman, and an enemy that melted into the population like smoke. Tanks belonged in the textbooks of conventional warfare, not in the rice bowls of revolutionary conflict. Major General William Westmoreland, commanding U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, had initially resisted the deployment of armor. His staff officers presented compelling arguments. The terrain was unsuitable. The logistics were nightmarish. Each Patton required 180 gallons of fuel for a single day's operation. The maintenance burden would drain resources better spent on helicopters and infantry. And most damning of all, the enemy had no tanks to fight. What good was a 49-ton hammer when you were hunting mosquitoes? But the mosquitoes were learning to sting. By early 1965, North Vietnamese Army regulars were pouring down the Ho Chi Minh Trail in regiment-sized formations, no longer content to conduct hit-and-run raids, but seeking to engage American forces in sustained combat. At Ia Drang Valley, just months before the Pattons landed, the People's Army of Vietnam had stood and fought against American air cavalry in battles that left the jungle floor carpeted with bodies. The war was evolving, and evolution demanded new tools. The M48 Patton that arrived in Vietnam was already a veteran of controversy. Born from the urgent lessons of the Korean War and rushed into production in 1952, the Patton represented America's first genuine main battle tank, a radical departure from the World War II-era Shermans and Pershings that had fought in Korea. Named after General George S. Patton, Jr., the legendary armored warfare commander who had died 7 years before the tank's debut, the M48 carried the weight of enormous expectations and even larger questions. Its development had been plagued by problems that would have killed lesser programs. The early M48 variants burned gasoline like a bonfire, consuming fuel at rates that made extended operations logistically impossible. The gasoline engines were catastrophically vulnerable to fire, a fact proven repeatedly in testing when anti-tank rounds turned the crew compartments into incinerators. Transmission failures were so common, the joke among tankers was that you needed 2 M48s for every mission, one to drive and one for parts. The Continental AV-1790 engine, coupled to the Allison cross-drive transmission, created a mechanical nightmare that maintenance crews cursed in languages the Army hadn't taught them. By 1959, sanity had prevailed. The M48A3 variant replaced the gasoline engine with the Continental AVDS 1790-2A diesel power plant, a 12-cylinder beast producing 750 horsepower that finally gave the Patton the reliability it needed. The diesel engine nearly doubled the operational range to 288 miles and eliminated the worst fire hazards. But the damage to the tank's reputation had been done. In military circles, the M48 was known as the Widowmaker, and sending it to Vietnam felt like doubling down on a losing bet. What the critics didn't understand, what none of them could have imagined in those early months of 1965, was that the central highlands of Vietnam would become the killing ground where the M48 Patton would prove every assumption wrong. The central highlands region of Vietnam was a landscape designed by a malevolent god. A vast plateau of mountains and valleys stretching from Cambodia to the South China Sea, it formed the strategic spine of South Vietnam. Control the highlands, and you controlled the infiltration routes from the north. Lose the highlands, and the coastal population centers would fall like dominoes. The French had learned this lesson in blood at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where an entire colonial army had been surrounded and destroyed in the mountains. The Americans were determined not to repeat that catastrophe, but the terrain seemed specifically designed to kill tanks. Jagged peaks rose to 7,000 feet, their slopes covered in vegetation so thick that a man could pass within 10 feet of an enemy and never see him. The valleys were quagmires during the monsoon season, rivers of red mud that could bog down even tracked vehicles. Dirt roads that looked solid in the dry season became impassable slurries when the rains came, which they did for 6 months of the year. And everywhere, hidden beneath the canopy, the enemy waited with mines, anti-tank rockets, and an intimate knowledge of terrain they had fought over for generations. Highway 19, a 2-lane paved road running from the coastal city of Quy Nhon to the highland city of Pleiku, became the lifeline for American operations in the region. French veterans called it the street without joy, a reference to the author Bernard Fall's devastating account of colonial defeat. The 65-mile stretch of asphalt wound through the Gaik Bang Yang Pass, a mountain choke point, where the Viet Minh had annihilated Mobile Group 100 in 1954, killing or capturing 3,000 French and Vietnamese troops in a single day. The burned-out hulks of French M24 Chaffee tanks still rusted in the undergrowth as grim reminders. Into this nightmare landscape came the 1st Battalion, 69th Armor Regiment, in August 1965, equipped with 57 M48A3 Patton tanks. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Fairfield commanded a unit that had trained for European combat, preparing to face Soviet T-55s on the North German plain in a war that thankfully never came. Instead, they found themselves tasked with securing Highway 19, keeping open a road that the enemy had turned into a death trap. The battalion's Charlie Company drew the most dangerous assignment. They would escort convoys along the entire length of Highway 19, from the coastal lowlands through Mang Yang Pass to the Highland garrison at An Khê. Each morning, before convoys could move, the tanks would sweep the road for mines, a terrifying task that turned the Pattons into 49-ton mine detectors. The M48's thick armor and powerful diesel engine made it one of the few vehicles that could survive a mine strike and keep fighting. But survival didn't mean comfort. The concussion of a mine detonation beneath the tracks could knock a crew unconscious, rupture eardrums, and cause traumatic brain injuries that wouldn't be diagnosed for decades. Sergeant First Class William Bull Henderson, a tank commander with Charlie Company, remembered those first patrols with a clarity that never faded. "We thought we knew what combat was. We trained for tank battles, hull-down positions, firing on the move. Then we got to Highway 19 and learned that the real enemy wasn't other tanks. It was the road itself. Every culvert could hide a mine. Every tree line concealed a rocket team. You'd be cruising along at 15 miles per hour, scanning the jungle, and suddenly the world would explode. The tank would lift off its tracks, come down hard, and you'd be deaf and bleeding and trying to figure out if the engine was still running. The mines were sophisticated beyond anything the Americans expected. The Viet Cong and NVA used a mixture of Soviet-supplied anti-tank mines, French ordnance left over from the previous war, and improvised explosives crafted from artillery shells and aircraft bombs. Some contained 25 pounds of TNT, enough to blow the track off a Patton and damage the road wheels. Others were command-detonated, triggered by observers, hidden in the jungle when maximum damage could be achieved. The most insidious were the daisy chains, multiple mines wired together to detonate in sequence, ensuring that if the first mine only damaged the tank, the second would finish it. Yet the Pattons survived. The M48's torsion bar suspension and track design distributed the blast force in ways that wheeled vehicles couldn't match. Tanks that struck mines would throw a track, requiring hours of repair work under fire, but they rarely suffered catastrophic kills. The crew compartment's armor protection, specifically the thick steel plate beneath the hull and the armored tub that held the crew positions, prevented mine blasts from penetrating into the fighting compartment. Tankers would be concussed, sometimes badly, but they lived. This survivability fundamentally changed the equation on Highway 19. Where truck convoys had been massacred, where armored personnel carriers had been destroyed, the Pattons drove through ambushes and lived. The psychological impact on the enemy was immediate and profound. The distinctive rumble of the Continental diesel engine, a deep bass note that carried for miles through the jungle, became a sound the Viet Cong learned to fear. In October 1965, the North Vietnamese 95B Regiment set up an elaborate ambush for a supply convoy moving through Mang Yang Pass. Intelligence indicated that over 1,200 enemy troops had positioned themselves along a 2-mile stretch of highway, with anti-tank recoilless rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and heavy machine guns covering the road from elevated positions. The plan was textbook Viet Minh tactics, refined through years of fighting the French. Let the convoy enter the killing zone, destroy the lead and rear vehicles to trap the column, then massacre everything in between. The convoy entered the pass on October 21st, with 4 M48 Pattons leading, 4 more in the column, and 4 bringing up the rear. The ambush was sprung perfectly, with the first RPG rounds impacting the lead truck moments after the tanks passed. But the enemy had made a fatal miscalculation. They had positioned their ambush for soft-skinned vehicles, not main battle tanks. Lieutenant Robert Jameson commanded the lead Patton, call sign Anvil 6. When the ambush exploded around them, his response was immediate and devastating. "Driver, reverse! Gunner, traverse right, tree line, 2 o'clock, 1,000 meters, high explosive, rapid fire." The turret whipped around with hydraulic precision, the 90mm main gun already loaded with high explosive rounds. The first shot hit the tree line 3 seconds after the ambush began, detonating in an airburst that shredded the jungle canopy and everything beneath it. The other Pattons responded in coordinated fury. Tank commanders identified firing positions by their muzzle flashes and methodically erased them with high explosive and canister rounds. The M48's fire control system, sophisticated for its era, included a stereoscopic rangefinder that provided accurate targeting data even in the chaos of combat. Gunners could engage multiple targets in rapid succession, the autoloader and well-drilled crews maintaining a rate of fire that shocked enemy forces accustomed to slower Soviet-designed tanks. The ambush lasted 47 minutes. When it was over, the convoy had lost 3 trucks and suffered 9 wounded. The enemy left behind 127 confirmed dead and abandoned. Weapons that indicated unit-level disintegration. More importantly, the Viet Cong and NVA learned a lesson they would never forget. Ambushing convoys with tank escorts was suicide. By early 1966, the 138th Armor had developed into a specialized force unlike any tank unit in the American military. They weren't fighting the war they had trained for, so they invented new doctrine in real time. The tanks operated in 4 tank platoons, maintaining mutual support distances that allowed overlapping fields of fire. They developed new formations for different terrain, new techniques for jungle busting, and new tactics for the uniquely Vietnamese problem of distinguishing civilians from combatants. The Thunder Run became a signature tactic. When intelligence indicated enemy concentrations near the highway, the Pattons would conduct high-speed sweeps, racing down Highway 19 at maximum speed while firing into suspected enemy positions. The psychological effect was devastating. The sight of 4 49-ton tanks roaring down the road at 30 miles per hour, firing their main guns and machine guns in continuous barrages, broke enemy nerve before contact was even made. But the most important innovation was the systematic integration of armor with infantry. The traditional American doctrine called for tanks to support infantry, but in Vietnam, the relationship became symbiotic. Infantry protected tanks from close-range anti-tank teams. Tanks provided infantry with mobile firepower and armored protection. Together, they created combined arms teams that could operate in terrain that should have been impassable to armor. Specialist 5 Dwight Hale Johnson, a tank driver with Company B, 1 to 69th Armor, exemplified this new form of warfare in January 1968. His platoon was conducting a route security operation near the village of Dak Tu when they encountered a major enemy force. In the battle that followed, Johnson's tank was hit by anti-tank fire that killed the tank commander and wounded the gunner. Rather than retreat, Johnson exited the burning vehicle, rallied nearby infantry, and led a counterattack that destroyed enemy positions and recovered wounded soldiers from other damaged vehicles. For 7 hours, Johnson fought on foot and in multiple tanks, refusing medical treatment for his wounds, directing fire, and personally engaging enemy positions with small arms and machine guns. When ammunition ran low, he commandeered another tank and continued the fight. By the time the battle ended, Johnson had killed an estimated 15 enemy soldiers and saved the lives of countless Americans. For his actions, he would receive the Medal of Honor, becoming one of the first African-American soldiers recognized for valor in Vietnam. Johnson's heroism illustrated a fundamental truth that the critics had missed. The war in Vietnam wasn't about the tanks. It was about the men who drove them, fought from them, and refused to accept defeat even when the machine was destroyed. The M48 Patton was just steel and diesel and ammunition. What made it deadly was the American soldier who transformed it into an instrument of will. The transformation of attitudes toward the Patton accelerated during the Tet Offensive of January 1968, when the war came to the cities and the jungle melted away to reveal conventional combat on an unexpected scale. The ancient imperial capital of Hue, a city of temples and narrow streets, became a battlefield that would rage for 26 days. Marine M48 Pattons brought ashore at Da Nang 3 years earlier to skepticism and doubt became the hammer that broke the back of North Vietnamese resistance. The Battle of Hue was urban warfare at its most brutal. North Vietnamese Army regulars had infiltrated the city and seized the ancient citadel, a fortress within the city proper that was built to withstand cannon fire. They dug in among the civilian population, turned every building into a bunker, and prepared to fight to the death. Marine infantry, trained for jungle combat, found themselves in close-quarters street fighting, reminiscent of World War II. The M48 Pattons entered Hugh on February 13, 1968, attached to the 1st Marine Regiment. Tank commanders initially hesitated to use their main guns in the confined urban terrain, worried about civilian casualties and collateral damage. That hesitation evaporated when they discovered that enemy forces were using schools, hospitals, and temples as fighting positions, betting that American squeamishness would protect them. Staff Sergeant Alfredo Gonzalez, a tank commander with Company A, 1st Tank Battalion, revolutionized urban tank warfare in Hugh through brutal trial and error. His technique became doctrine. Advance down the street with infantry in close support. Take fire from a building. Mark the building with white phosphorus. Pull back and engage with high explosive rounds until the structure collapsed. Advance through the rubble. Repeat. The 90mm gun proved devastatingly effective in urban combat. A single high explosive round could penetrate multiple walls, detonating inside buildings and creating overpressure waves that killed defenders even in fortified positions. The canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun shells loaded with hundreds of steel flechettes, turned narrow streets into killing zones where exposed infantry had nowhere to hide. In one engagement near the Citadel wall, Gonzalez's platoon encountered a reinforced enemy position that had stopped Marine infantry cold. The position consisted of 3 connected buildings with interlocking fields of fire, protected by sandbagged positions and anti-tank defenses. Conventional tactics would have required prolonged artillery preparation and costly infantry assault. Gonzalez had a different idea. He ordered his 4 tanks to approach in column, each offset slightly from the one ahead. As they advanced, each tank fired a steady stream of machine gun fire to suppress the enemy and protect the infantry. Following behind, at 200 meters range, the lead tank fired a white phosphorus round into the central building, marking it with burning smoke. The following tanks then engaged in sequence, each firing 3 high explosive rounds into the marked structure. The building didn't just collapse, it disintegrated. The combination of successive explosions weakened the structural integrity until the entire edifice fell into its own footprint, burying the defenders under tons of rubble. The adjacent buildings, shocked by the concussive force and stripped of their defensive cover, surrendered shortly after. The entire action took less than 10 minutes. No Marines were killed. Gonzalez would later receive the Navy Cross for his actions in Hugh, though he wouldn't live to receive it. He was killed in action on February 4th, leading another assault on enemy positions. The Battle of Hugh conclusively proved that the M48 Patton could fight in any terrain under any conditions. The jungles had been conquered, the rice paddies had been crossed, the cities had been taken street by street. But the ultimate vindication of the Patton's design came not in a city or a jungle, but in the mountains of the Central Highlands, in a battle that would be the only tank versus tank engagement between American and North Vietnamese forces during the entire war. Ben Het Special Forces Camp sat in a saddle between mountain ridges, 15 miles from the tri-border region where Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia met. It was a forward fire base designed to monitor the Ho Chi Minh Trail and disrupt enemy infiltration. The camp was home to 12 Green Berets from the 5th Special Forces Group, 400 civilian irregular defense group fighters recruited from the Montagnard tribes, and a collection of artillery and anti-aircraft weapons. It was isolated, exposed, and strategically vital. In March 1969, intelligence reports indicated that the North Vietnamese 66th Regiment was massing near the Cambodian border, preparing for a major assault. The regiment had recently been re-equipped with Soviet armor, including PT-76 amphibious light tanks and BTR-50 armored personnel carriers. This was unprecedented. The North Vietnamese had previously avoided committing their limited armor assets to combat, hoarding them for the final offensive they believed would come. The decision to employ tanks against Ben Het indicated that something had changed in Hanoi's calculations. U.S. commanders responded by reinforcing the camp with a platoon from Company B, 1 269th Armor. 4 M48A3 Pattons made the dangerous journey up Highway 19 and into the mountains, navigating roads that were barely wide enough for the tanks to pass. Captain John P. Stovall commanded the detachment, positioning 3 tanks in hull-down defensive positions on a hill overlooking the camp's western perimeter, with the 4th tank guarding the southern approach. The terrain gave the defenders enormous advantages. The M48s were dug in with only their turrets, visible, presenting minimal target profiles while maintaining clear fields of fire across the approaches to the camp. Their 90mm guns could engage targets at ranges where the PT-76's 76mm gun would be ineffective. The Patton's armor could withstand hits from the lighter Soviet tank, while a single round from the 90mm would destroy a PT-76 absolutely. On the night of March that in 1969, Sergeant First Class Hugh H. Havermale reported unusual sounds to Captain Stovall. Diesel engines, heavy vehicles moving through the jungle, the unmistakable clank of tracks on rocky ground. The defenders went to full alert, loading high-explosive anti-tank rounds and scanning the darkness with infrared searchlights and night vision equipment. The attack came at 2100 hours on March 3rd. Artillery and mortar fire saturated the camp's perimeter, a preparation barrage designed to suppress defensive fires and create chaos. Under cover of the bombardment, the 4th Battalion, 202nd Armored Regiment, advanced with at least a dozen PT-76 tanks and supporting infantry. Then, at approximately 800 meters from the camp perimeter, an anti-tank mine detonated beneath one of the advancing PT-76. The explosion illuminated the entire enemy column in stark relief. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry advancing in textbook Soviet doctrine formation. The burning PT-76 became a beacon that lit the killing zone with flickering orange light. The M48 Pattons opened fire. Specialist 4 Frank Hembry, gunner on tank, Assassin 21, acquired the first target. His report was laconic. PT-76, 800 meters, stationary. The gunner's manual called for a steady, controlled engagement procedure. Range to target, select ammunition type, acquire target in sight, fire for effect. Hembry bypassed the procedure. He put the crosshairs on the burning tank next to the target and fired. The 90mm high-explosive anti-tank round hit the PT-76 center mass. The lighter Soviet tank's armor, designed to allow amphibious operations and maximize speed, provided virtually no protection against the American gun. The heat round penetrated the hull and detonated inside the crew compartment, the shaped charge jet of superheated metal turning the interior into an inferno. The PT-76 exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary explosion that sent the turret cartwheeling through the air. The other M48s engaged in rapid succession. Tank commanders called out targets. Gunners acquired and fired. Loaders slammed fresh rounds into the breach with mechanical precision. The rate of fire was devastating. American tank crews had trained for years to fight outnumbered against Soviet armor in Europe. 4 tanks against a dozen was exactly the scenario they had drilled for endlessly. A second PT-76 exploded. A BTR-50 personnel carrier burst into flames, its thin armor no match for the American guns. The North Vietnamese tankers, trained by Soviet advisors in tactics designed for the plains of Eastern Europe, discovered that those tactics were suicidal in the confined terrain of the Central Highlands. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't use their speed. They couldn't bring their superior numbers to bear. They could only die. The battle intensified. Enemy fire now concentrated on the exposed American positions, and the defenders learned that tank-on-tank combat was a two-way street. An NVA round struck Havermale's tank, penetrating the loader's hatch and killing both the loader and driver instantly. Captain Stovall and Sergeant Havermale were blown from the tank by the blast, peppered with shrapnel but alive. Staff Sergeant Jerry W. Jones, the tank's gunner, survived the hit and immediately took command. Rather than abandon the damaged vehicle, he organized a new crew from nearby infantry and got the tank back into action within minutes. This was American tanker ethos made manifest. The mission comes first. The tank stays in the fight. The crew keeps killing until there's nothing left to kill with. The North Vietnamese attempted a second assault from a different direction, trying to flank the American positions. Illumination rounds from camp mortars lit the battlefield in flickering sodium light. An AC-47 spooky gunship arrived overhead, its three 7.62-meter miniguns pouring fire into the enemy infantry. The PT-76 continued to advance, their commanders showing courage that was admirable even as it proved futile. Specialist 4 Eddie Davis, now manning the gun on the damaged tank, acquired targets by watching for muzzle flashes in the darkness. He didn't have functioning optics. He didn't have a working rangefinder. He had a 90mm gun and the determination to use it. His third shot destroyed another PT-76 at point-blank range, less than 300 meters. The Soviet tank literally came apart, the hull rupturing along its welded seams from the overpressure of the internal explosion. By midnight, the battle was over. The North Vietnamese withdrew, leaving behind the burning hulks of two PT-76 tanks and one BTR-50 personnel carrier. The Americans counted their cost: 2 killed, 2 wounded, 1 M48 damaged but repairable. The disparity in casualties told the story of technological supremacy. The Patton had been designed to fight and win against Soviet armor. In the only tank battle of the Vietnam War, it had done exactly that. The Battle of Ben Heat had enormous strategic implications far beyond the tactical victory. North Vietnamese military planners realized that their armor was obsolete against American main battle tanks. The PT-76, effective against infantry and light vehicles, was a death trap when facing the Patton. The decision to employ armor against fortified positions had cost them precious assets they couldn't replace. More importantly, it had revealed their tactical playbook to American intelligence. The battle also vindicated every argument for deploying armor to Vietnam. The critics who claimed tanks had no place in Southeast Asian warfare were proven wrong by the only battle that mattered: a direct engagement between opposing armor forces. The M48 Patton had faced the exact scenario the critics said would never happen and had dominated completely. But Ben Hecht was an anomaly. Tank-on-tank combat in Vietnam would remain rare, almost non-existent. The real war for the Patton tanks continued in the daily grind of convoy escort, route security, and infantry support. This was the unsexy, unglamorous work that won wars slowly, 1 mile of secured highway at a time. By late 1969, the 169th Armor had refined their operations to a science. They maintained 4 tank quick reaction forces at strategic positions along Highway 19, ready to respond to ambushes or enemy contact within minutes. They conducted systematic minesweeping operations every morning before convoys moved, using experimental mine detection equipment and the hard-earned knowledge of where the enemy preferred to place explosives. They integrated with infantry units at the company level, developing combined arms tactics that maximized the strengths of both arms. The kill markings on the turrets told the story of relentless combat. Sergeant Henderson's tank Devil Dog bore 23 marks, each representing a confirmed enemy position destroyed or vehicle eliminated. Other tanks in the battalion displayed similar tallies. These weren't the aerial victories of fighter pilots, glamorous and clean. These were the brutal acknowledgments of close-quarters combat, of enemy bunkers crushed under tracks, of ambushes reversed and turned into massacres. The crews developed superstitions and rituals. They gave their tanks names like Annihilator, Thunderbolt, and Iron Hammer, painting the names on the gun tubes with loving care. They decorated the hulls with spare track blocks, sandbags, and extra machine gun ammunition, transforming the tanks into rolling fortresses bristling with improvised armor. They hung hammocks from the fenders for sleeping in the field, swinging gently in the night air while they took turns on guard duty. They also learned to respect the enemy. The Viet Cong and NVA weren't stupid. They adapted to the presence of armor with impressive speed, developing new tactics specifically designed to counter tanks. They began using command-detonated mines that waited until the tank had passed before exploding beneath the more vulnerable engine compartment. They targeted tank commanders exposed in their cupolas with sniper fire. They employed massed rocket-propelled grenade attacks, coordinating multiple launchers to strike the same target simultaneously and overwhelm the armor. In response, the tankers adapted. They fabricated crude standoff armor from pierced steel planking, chain-link fence, and cases of sea rations, mounting them on the hull to prematurely detonate shaped charge warheads. They repositioned the .50 caliber machine gun from inside the commander's cupola to an external mount, allowing suppressive fire without exposing the tank commander. They painted Vietnamese warning messages on the turrets. Danger! Do not ride bicycles alongside. A grim acknowledgement that civilians who got too close to tanks during operations were often revealed to be enemy observers. The psychological warfare aspects of armor employment were equally important as the kinetic effects. The mere presence of Patton tanks in an area changed enemy behavior. Ambushes that would have been sprung against infantry or wheeled vehicles were aborted when tanks appeared. Enemy units avoided areas known to be patrolled by armor. The sound of tank engines became associated with death and destruction, a Pavlovian trigger that induced genuine fear among enemy forces. Captain Michael Rodriguez, an intelligence officer who interrogated prisoners throughout 1968 and 1969, documented this psychological dimension. The Viet Cong called them steel elephants. They had no effective counter to them. RPGs were marginally effective. Recoilless rifles required suicidal point-blank range, and mines were as likely to kill civilians as tanks. The prisoners all reported the same thing. When the tanks came, you ran. You didn't fight. You didn't try to be a hero. You ran and hoped they went somewhere else. This psychological dominance created strategic effects far beyond the tactical level. Highway 19 remained open throughout the war because the enemy knew that attacking convoys meant facing armor. Fire support bases in the central Highlands could be supplied because the tanks could escort the supply columns through the most dangerous terrain. Infantry operations could be conducted in areas previously considered too dangerous because the Pattons could provide mobile fire support and rapid evacuation for casualties. The statistics told a story of grinding success. Between 1965 and 1970, the 169th Armor conducted over 15,000 convoy escort missions along Highway 19. They lost 23 tanks to all causes, including combat damage, mechanical failure, and accidents. In exchange, they accounted for over 3,000 confirmed enemy casualties and kept the lifeline to the Central Highlands open throughout the most intensive period of the war. But wars aren't won solely by body counts and open highways. By 1969, American policy was shifting toward Vietnamization, the process of transferring combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces while reducing American troop presence. The M48 Pattons became central to this strategy, as hundreds of tanks were turned over to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam's newly formed armored units. The ARVN tankers learned to operate the Pattons under American instruction, attending training courses that compressed years of experience into weeks of intensive instruction. They learned maintenance, gunnery, tactics, and combined arms operations. They were competent, professional, and brave. What they lacked was the logistical infrastructure and industrial base that made American armor operations possible. When the Easter Offensive exploded across South Vietnam in March 1972, ARVN M48s faced their ultimate test. North Vietnamese forces, equipped with Soviet T-54 and T-55 main battle tanks, launched conventional armored assaults across the DMZ and into the Central Highlands. Tank-on-tank battles erupted across South Vietnam in combat reminiscent of World War II. The ARVN 20th Tank Regiment, equipped with M48A3s, fought desperately at Quang Tri and Con Tum. In individual engagements, ARVN tankers proved themselves equal to their North Vietnamese counterparts, destroying enemy armor and holding critical positions. But the strategic situation was hopeless. American air support was limited. Ammunition supplies were constrained by congressional cutoffs. Fuel was rationed to the point that tanks sat immobile for lack of diesel. On April 23, 1972, the ARVN 20th Tank Regiment encountered a new threat that would revolutionize anti-tank warfare. North Vietnamese infantry teams, armed with 9 M14 Malyutka wire-guided anti-tank missiles, engaged ARVN M48s near Con Tum. The Sagar missiles, as NATO designated them, could be launched from positions several kilometers away and guided onto target by an operator watching through a periscope. They were immune to machine gun fire, invisible until launch, and devastatingly effective. An ARVN M48A3 and an M113 armored cavalry assault vehicle became the first American-made armor destroyed by guided missiles, presaging a technological revolution that would reshape armored warfare. By May 2nd, the entire ARVN 20th Tank Regiment had been destroyed. 100 tanks lost to enemy fire, mechanical breakdown, and lack of fuel. The Easter Offensive demonstrated that technology alone couldn't win wars. Logistics, industrial capacity, and political will mattered as much as the quality of individual weapons. When Saigon fell in April 1975, hundreds of M48 Pattons were captured intact by North Vietnamese forces, abandoned by ARVN units that had run out of ammunition and fuel. The North Vietnamese briefly experimented with incorporating the captured tanks into their own forces, but quickly discovered what American maintenance crews had known for years. The M48 was a maintenance-intensive machine that required a sophisticated logistical infrastructure to keep operational. Most captured Pattons ended their days as war memorials scattered across Vietnam, parked in front of museums and government buildings as trophies of victory. In a final irony, the tanks that had dominated the battlefields of the Central Highlands became tourist attractions, photographed by visitors who had no idea of the blood and fire and desperate courage those steel hulls represented. For the American tankers who had fought in Vietnam, the legacy of the M48 Patton was complicated. The tank had proven itself in combat, exceeding all expectations and confounding every critic. It had fought in terrain that should have been impossible for armor. It had survived mine strikes that should have been fatal. It had faced enemy tanks and destroyed them. It had saved countless infantry lives by providing mobile firepower when and where it was needed. But the men who crewed the Pattons knew that wars weren't won by machines. They were won by the men inside the machines, by the mechanics who kept them running, by the officers who employed them wisely, and by the strategic decisions made in Washington and Saigon that were far beyond the control of any tank crew. In 1982, at a reunion of the 1 to 69th Armor Association in Colorado Springs, the veterans gathered to remember and to reflect. Master Sergeant Henderson, retired now but still called Bull by his friends, stood before his old tank, lovingly restored and displayed at Fort Carson. Someone asked him if the M48 had been a good tank. Henderson was quiet for a long time, his hand resting on the hull where scars from enemy fire had been painted over but never truly erased. When he spoke, his voice was soft but certain. The tank did what we asked it to do. It carried us into hell and brought us back. It killed our enemies and protected our friends. It broke down, sure, and it wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and we were proud to crew it. Every time I see one of these steel elephants, I don't think about the machine. I think about the men who fought from them, the men who died in them, the men who lived because of them. The M48 wasn't just a good tank, it was our tank, and that makes all the difference. The M48 Patton served with American forces until the mid-1970s, when it was finally replaced by the M60 Patton series and later by the M1 Abrams. Over 12,000 were built, serving with dozens of nations across 6 continents. It fought in the Indo-Pakistani Wars, where Pakistani Pattons faced Indian Centurions and Soviet tanks. It dominated the battlefields of the Six-Day War, where Israeli M48s equipped with British 105mm guns destroyed Egyptian and Syrian armor in the largest tank battle since World War II. But nowhere did the M48 prove itself more thoroughly than in the jungles, rice paddies, and mountains of Vietnam. In a war where its deployment was questioned, in terrain that seemed designed to defeat it, against an enemy that had no tanks of its own to fight, the Patton became the weapon that critics said could never work. The French advisers who had shaken their heads in 1965 were proven wrong. The American staff officers who questioned the wisdom of deploying armor were proven wrong. The armchair strategists who proclaimed that tanks had no place in counterinsurgency warfare were proven wrong. The proof was written in steel and blood along Highway 19, in the streets of Hue, and in the mountain passes of the Central Highlands. When the last American M48 Patton left Vietnam in 1972, it departed a landscape it had helped to shape. The roads it had patrolled remained open. The bases it had defended stood intact. The enemy it had faced knew its power intimately and feared it absolutely. The skeptics had laughed at the idea of tanks in the jungle. They weren't laughing anymore. The thunder of the M48 Patton's diesel engine and the crack of its 90mm gun had spoken, and the Central Highlands had listened. In the end, the steel elephants had become instruments of American will in a war that tested every assumption and challenged every doctrine. The M48 Patton didn't just survive Vietnam, it conquered it, 1 mile of highway at a time. The legacy endures in the memories of the men who crewed them, in the restored tanks displayed at military museums across America, and in the sobering recognition that wars are won not by the weapons we deploy, but by the courage of the men and women who use them. The M48 Patton was a machine, but in the hands of American tankers fighting in impossible conditions against a determined enemy, it became something more, a symbol of adaptation, determination, and the refusal to accept defeat. They laughed at the M48 Patton tanks when they rolled ashore at Da Nang in 1965. By 1969, nobody was laughing. The steel elephants had trumpeted their arrival, and the Central Highlands would never be the same.